I should have listened to the old woman at the check-in desk. Room 406? She repeated, her pale, watery eyes narrowing at me. Are you sure about that one? I was tired, road-weary, and not in the mood for cryptic warnings. It was late, and every other hotel in this nowhere town was full. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. I'm sure. She paused, her thin hand hovering over the stack of keys. Strange things happened in that room. My polite smile wavered. I'll take my chances. With a shake of her head, she handed me the brass key. It was cold and heavier than I expected, its tag etched with a weathered 406. I tossed my duffel bag over my shoulder and climbed the creaky stairs, her words sticking with me despite my exhaustion. The hallway on the 4th floor smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning solution. The carpet, worn thin by decades of footsteps, muffled the sound of my boots as I walked to the end of the corridor. Room 406 sat there, the last door, its number hanging crookedly on the tarnished brass plate. The key turned smoothly in the lock, the door swinging inward to reveal a room trapped in the past. The wallpaper, a once bright floral pattern, had dulled to a muted yellow. The bedspread was a scratchy green, the kind you find in motels that advertise color television as a feature. And then there was the mirror. It hung directly across from the bed, the glass held in an ornate, gilded frame that seemed far too elegant for a place like this. The mirror's surface was spotless, almost unnervingly clean, as though someone had just polished it. I set my bag down and tried to shake off the unease. It was just a room, I told myself. A bed, a chair, a desk, a TV that probably did not work. Nothing unusual, nothing to fear. But as I lay down, the mirror seemed to tug at the corner of my vision. No matter where I looked, I could feel it there looming, its presence heavy and suffocating. I turned my back to it, pulling the blanket over me, and shut my eyes. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a faint creak like a footstep on an old wooden floor. My eyes flew open, heart pounding. The room was silent. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing, an old building settling in the night. But as I rolled over, I made the mistake of glancing at the mirror. In its reflection, I swore I saw something move. I froze, staring at the mirror. My reflection was there, of course, but something was off. The room behind me looked darker in the glass than it did in real life, as if the mirror was showing a version of the room where the shadows were heavier, deeper. I forced a laugh, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Get a grip, I muttered under my breath, turning away. But I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sleep felt impossible, so I swung my legs off the bed and walked over to the desk. My laptop was dead. Of course it was, and my phone signal was barely holding on. I rummaged in my bag for a charger and glanced back at the mirror. My reflection was not doing what I was doing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure in the glass, me but not me, was still sitting on the bed, staring back at me. My hands began to shake as I blinked, hoping the reflection would reset itself. It didn't. The figure on the bed tilted its head, almost curiously, and then it smiled. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice shaking. My reflection should not have been able to smile. I was not smiling. The thing in the mirror raised a hand and slowly waved at me. I grabbed the chair, clutching it like a shield. This is a dream, I told myself. This has to be a dream. The sound of creaking would echo through the room again, but this time it came from behind me. My stomach dropped. Slowly I turned around. Nothing. The room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure in the reflection was no longer sitting on the bed. It was standing right behind me. I spun around, swinging the chair wildly, but the room was empty. There was nothing behind me. No shadowy figure, no distorted version of myself. Just the same faded wallpaper and scratchy bedspread. But when I turned back to the mirror, it was still there. The figure loomed in the reflection, standing directly behind me, though there was no one in the room. It looked like me, but wrong. Its features were twisted slightly, the edges of its face blurry, as if it were struggling to hold its shape. I staggered back, my heart racing so hard it felt like it might burst. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The figure tilted its head again, just like before. Its expression was almost playful, but there was something in its eyes, a hunger that made my skin crawl. "Leave me alone," I shouted, grabbing my duffel bag and throwing it at the mirror. The bag slammed into the glass with a dull thud, but the mirror didn't so much as shudder. Instead, the figure began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that did not come from the room around me. It came from inside my own head, echoing in my mind like the toll of a heavy bell. I backed away until I hit the wall, my chest heaving with each panicked breath. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. It was as though the room itself was holding me in place. The figure in the mirror leaned closer to the glass, its distorted face filling the frame. Then it raised a single finger and pointed down to the base of the mirror. At first, I didn't understand. Then I saw it. There was something sticking out from behind the mirror's frame, just barely visible in the dim light. A slip of paper, yellowed with age and curled at the edges. I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct in my body told me to leave it alone, to run from this cursed room and never look back. But I had to know. Hands trembling, I reached for the paper and pulled it free. The moment I did, the laughter stopped. The room was plunged into an oppressive silence, so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, revealing a single sentence scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Do not look away." My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared at the note, the words practically etched into my mind. "Do not look away." I glanced back at the mirror, clutching the crumpled paper in my hand. The figure was still there, grinning wider now, its mouth stretching unnaturally far. Its eyes seemed to burn with a flickering, dark light that made my stomach churn. I felt trapped. If I looked away, I might break whatever thin thread of safety I was clinging to. But keeping my eyes locked on the mirror meant staying face to face with whatever this thing was. "Why?" I whispered to no one in particular. My voice barely sounded like my own. The figure did not move, but its reflection seemed to shimmer, almost like ripples across a still pond. The air in the room grew colder, and the light bulb overhead flickered once, twice, before settling into a dim, sickly glow. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My body was screaming for me to run, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor. "What are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The thing in the mirror didn't answer, but its grin faltered. Slowly, its head tilted to one side, and it raised one hand to press against the glass. Its fingers left smudges that seemed to pulse faintly, like they were alive. And then it pointed again, this time at me. My breath caught as I saw it, a shadow. Not the figure in the mirror, but something behind me, stretching long and thin across the room. I turned my head slightly, against my better judgment, and caught sight of it. There was no source for the shadow, no object or person to cast it. Yet there it was, stretching toward me like a grasping hand. My eyes darted back to the mirror. The figure's grin widened again, its expression brimming with malicious glee. It had wanted me to see the shadow. The words on the paper flashed through my mind. "Do not look away." I kept my gaze locked on the mirror as the shadow grew darker, creeping closer. I could feel it now, a cold, oppressive weight pressing against my back, crawling up my spine like ice-cold fingers. My breathing grew ragged, and the room seemed to tilt around me, the walls narrowing in. I clenched my fists, the paper crumpling in my palm, and forced myself to speak. "What do you want from me?" The figure's mouth moved, forming words, but no sound came. And then, in a voice that wasn't mine, but seemed to come from everywhere at once, I heard the answer. To open the door, I stood frozen, my mind racing as the figure's words echoed in my head. To open the door. "What door?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow behind me pulsed, its edges rippling like a living thing. The cold it radiated grew sharper, almost unbearable, and I swore I could feel it pressing against my skin now, heavy and suffocating. The figure in the mirror did not respond. Instead, it pressed both palms flat against the glass and leaned closer, so close its distorted face filled the entire reflection. Its eyes burned like dying embers, fixed directly on mine. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. "I do not know what you want," I shouted, my voice cracking. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the mirror was empty. My reflection was gone. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I spun around wildly, half expecting to see the figure standing in the room with me. But there was nothing, just the faint outline of that impossible shadow, slithering across the floor like smoke. And then I heard it, the sound of something creaking, soft but unmistakable. It was coming from the wardrobe. A tall, battered piece of furniture stood in the corner of the room, its door slightly ajar. I hadn't paid it much attention before, but now it loomed like a dark sentinel. The creaking sound came again, louder this time, as if something inside was shifting. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "I am not opening that." But the shadow had other ideas. It surged forward, a cold gust of wind following in its wake, and wrapped around the wardrobe like a coiling snake. The door creaked open wider, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. I could feel the pull of it, an invisible force dragging me forward. My feet moved against my will step by step until I was standing directly in front of the wardrobe. "Open it," the voice hissed, slithering through my mind like oil. "No," I shouted, planting my feet. "Leave me alone." The shadow pulsed angrily, and the chill in the air deepened. My breath came out in sharp, visible puffs, and my fingers were numb with cold. Then the wardrobe door swung open on its own, revealing what lay inside. At first, I thought it was empty. The darkness was so complete, it seemed to swallow the light from the room. But as I peered closer, I realized there was something there. Something small and glinting faintly in the void. A key. The shadow writhed excitedly, and the voice spoke again, louder this time. "Take it. Open the door." My hand trembled as I reached for the key, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop. But I was no longer in control. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, the shadow surged forward, enveloping me completely. The room vanished in an instant, replaced by a suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. And in that darkness, I heard it, a low, guttural laugh that chilled me to my core. I do not know how long I stayed in that blackness, trapped in the shadow's icy grip. It was as if time itself had unraveled, leaving me suspended in an endless, suffocating void. The key in my hand grew heavier, colder, until it felt like it was burning my skin. I wanted to let go of it, to fling it away, but my fingers refused to obey. Then, just as suddenly as the darkness had consumed me, it began to recede. The shadows peeled back, curling away like smoke caught in a draft. Slowly, my surroundings came into focus. I was no longer in the motel room. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint, metallic tang of decay. I stood in a narrow corridor, the walls on either side made of rough, crumbling stone. A faint light flickered at the far end, its sickly glow casting eerie, shifting shadows. The key in my hand seemed to pulse, almost like a heartbeat, pulling me forward. Every step I took echoed down the corridor, the sound bouncing back to me as if mocking my hesitation. The shadows on the walls moved strangely, shifting and twisting in ways that didn't match the light. They seemed alive, writhing like they were trying to break free from the stone. At the end of the corridor stood a door. It was massive, towering above me, its surface covered in strange, intricate carvings that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The metal was dark and mottled, as if corroded by centuries of neglect, but the handle gleamed like it had just been polished. The key in my hand grew heavier, tugging me toward the door like a magnet. I paused, my heart pounding. I had no idea what lay beyond, but every fiber of my being told me it wasn't something I wanted to see. "Open it," the voice hissed again, louder now, more insistent. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I won't." The air around me grew colder, and the shadows on the walls began to pulse and writhe. They stretched out toward me, their shapes taking on grotesque, half-formed faces that leered and snarled. "Open it!" the voice roared, reverberating through the corridor like a thunderclap. My knees buckled under the weight of the sound, and I fell forward, clutching the key to my chest. The door seemed to loom closer, its carvings twisting and writhing like living things. I tried to fight it, tried to resist the pull, but it was useless. My hand moved on its own, raising the key toward the lock. The moment the key slid into place, the corridor fell silent. The shadows froze, their faces locked in expressions of grim anticipation. And then, with a deafening click, the door began to open. The door groaned as it swung open, the sound deep and guttural, like the growl of some ancient beast. A cold wind surged out from the widening crack, carrying with it a stench so foul I gagged. It was the smell of rot and earth, of something long buried clawing its way back into the world. Beyond the door was nothing but darkness. Not the kind of darkness you find in an unlit room, but a vast, oppressive void that seemed to devour the faint light from the corridor. I couldn't see the floor, the walls, or any edges. It was as if the space stretched infinitely in every direction. And then I saw them, shapes moving in the black. They were faint at first, like shadows against shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, they became clearer. Twisted forms writhed in the darkness, their outlines jagged and wrong, as if they were breaking apart and reforming with every movement. I stumbled back, but the pull of the key was relentless. My feet dragged forward against my will, drawing me closer to the threshold. A voice came from the darkness, low and resonant, cutting through the howling wind. It was not the voice I had heard before. It was something older, deeper, and full of malice. "You have opened the way." "No!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." The key grew hotter in my hand, searing my palm. I tried to drop it, but it was fused to my skin as if it were a part of me now. The wind grew stronger, whipping around me with a piercing howl, and carried faint whispers, an overwhelming chorus of overlapping voices, too numerous and jumbled to comprehend. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know what you want." The shadows within the darkness began to move faster, converging toward the open door. Their forms became more distinct, elongated limbs, hollow faces with mouths stretched unnaturally wide. They poured toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets with their strings cut. I tried to run, but my legs refused to move. My body was rooted to the spot, trembling as the figures surged closer. The voice spoke again, its tone laced with cruel amusement. "We have waited so long. You will be the first." "The first for what?" I screamed, but the answer came not in words, but in the shifting of the shadows. They surged forward, crossing the threshold of the door. The moment they touched the air of the corridor, the walls began to tremble, the carvings on the door lighting up with a dull, crimson glow. The figures clawed their way toward me, their twisted limbs stretching impossibly far. One of them reached me, its cold, bony fingers brushing my face. A shock of pain shot through my skull, and my vision blurred. Images flooded my mind, flashes of places I didn't recognize, of horrors too vast to comprehend. A barren landscape under a black sky, rivers of red cutting through jagged stone, and at the center of it all, something massive and formless, writhing with countless limbs. I screamed, but no sound came out. The shadows began to pull me toward the door. Their touch was ice cold and burning all at once, seeping into my skin like tar. The corridor faded around me, replaced by the endless void on the other side of the threshold. And as I was dragged into the darkness, I realized the truth. The door wasn't meant to keep something out. It was meant to keep something in. The moment my body crossed the threshold, the world collapsed into silence. No wind, no whispers, no distant hum of life. Just an oppressive stillness that felt alive, watching, waiting. The shadows dragged me deeper into the void, their cold grip tightening around my arms and legs. My screams were swallowed by the darkness, my voice disappearing as if the air had been ripped from my lungs. There was no ground beneath my feet, yet I wasn't falling. I was suspended, held aloft by those grotesque figures. Their forms twisted and contorted around me, their hollow eyes glowing faintly, like embers on the verge of extinguishing. Ahead, a light flickered in the distance, small and weak, yet impossibly far away. It pulsed like a dying star, drawing me toward it against my will. "You will be the first," the voice boomed again, cutting through the silence like a blade. "The first for what?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figures around me writhed in unison, as if laughing silently. One leaned in close, its featureless face inches from mine. Its breath, if it could be called that, reeked of decay and burned my skin. The first to open the gate, it rasped. I struggled against their grip, but the shadows were unyielding, pulling me closer to the pulsing light. As we approached, I realized it wasn't just a light. It was a door, glowing faintly in the void. This one was different from the first. It was vast, stretching far beyond the edges of my vision, and its surface was covered in intricate symbols that pulsed with a sickly red glow. The symbols felt alive, writhing and shifting like snakes. Each time I blinked, they seemed to change, rearranging themselves into patterns that made my head ache and my vision blur. The shadows stopped abruptly, holding me just before the door. The silence pressed down on me, and the weight of the darkness felt unbearable. The voice returned, louder now, reverberating through the void. "You are the key." I shook my head violently. "No, I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this." The door began to pulse, its glow intensifying with each beat. The symbols writhed faster, and the figures around me began to chant, not in words I could understand, but in a guttural, inhuman rhythm that vibrated through my entire body. The key in my hand burned brighter, its heat searing my skin. I tried to drop it, but my fingers were locked around it, fused as if it were part of me. "Complete the cycle," the voice commanded. The chanting grew louder, the figures writhing and shifting in a frenzy. The door seemed to call to me, pulling at my very essence, and the key began to glow in time with its pulsing light. "I won't do it," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. But it didn't matter. My arm moved on its own, lifting the key toward the massive lock at the center of the door. The moment the key touched the surface, the void erupted with a deafening roar. The shadows shrieked, their forms dissolving into smoke, and the door swung open with an earth-shattering crash. What lay beyond was not darkness, but light, blinding, searing light that burned my eyes and filled my mind with incomprehensible images. A towering, formless entity emerged, its presence so vast it felt like it would crush me under its weight. And then, as I stood frozen, staring into the abyss, I realized what the shadows had meant. I wasn't just the key, I was the sacrifice. The light from the doorway was overwhelming, a living thing that consumed everything it touched. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold, sharp, and merciless. I couldn't look away, though every instinct screamed for me to shut my eyes, to shield myself from the unbearable sight. The towering entity stepped forward, or perhaps it simply extended itself, its form ever-shifting and incomprehensible. It was neither solid nor entirely formless, made of writhing shapes that defied logic. Eyes appeared and vanished across its surface, too many to count, each staring directly into my soul. I was paralyzed. My body refused to move as the entity loomed closer, its sheer presence pushing down on me like a physical weight. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and my heart felt as though it would tear itself apart. "You have opened the way," the voice boomed again, no longer disembodied. It came from the entity itself, a cacophony of tones, some human, some not, layered over one another. "I did not mean to," I cried, my voice breaking. "I didn't know." The entity paused, its many eyes narrowing in unison. "Ignorance does not absolve you. The cycle must begin. The shadows that had dragged me into the void were gone now, but their absence offered no comfort. Instead, tendrils of light began to extend from the entity, reaching toward me with an eerie, deliberate slowness. They moved like liquid, shimmering and shifting, yet each tendril felt solid as it wrapped around my arms, my legs, my throat. The moment they touched me, a flood of sensations crashed into my mind. I saw places I couldn't name, times I couldn't fathom, endless worlds swallowed by this thing, consumed in its unending hunger. I felt their pain, their despair, their terror, and it was more than I could bear. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Please let me go." The entity's eyes glowed brighter, and the tendrils tightened their grip. "You are the beginning and the end. Through you we awaken." I tried to scream, but the sound was ripped from my throat as the tendrils lifted me higher, pulling me toward the glowing doorway. The closer I got, the more my body burned, as if the light itself was peeling me apart. Memories began to slip away, unraveling like threads pulled from a frayed tapestry. My name, my past, my very sense of self, gone, swallowed by the entity's all-encompassing presence. I was no longer me. I was nothing but a vessel, a key to a door that should never have been opened. As the light consumed me, I felt one final, fleeting thought: regret. Regret for signing my name in that motel guest book. Regret for ignoring the old woman's warning. Regret for touching that curse key. And then there was nothing. When the light faded, the corridor was empty. The door stood ajar, its glow dimming to nothingness, and the key lay on the ground, its surface dark and lifeless. Far away, back in the motel, room 406 fell silent once more. The next traveler would arrive in a few days, weary from the road and desperate for a place to stay. And the cycle would begin again.